It's Tuesday, November the 9th. Today, we will hear from three brilliant but special souls, truly. I'm so excited to share some friends with you on how we can tap into ancient wisdom and faith to advance human flourishing through business and entrepreneurship. Now, lest you're tuning in thinking this is some lesson of theology that you never cared to learn about in college, it's not that. It's partly that, but these are three amazing thinkers and builders and investors who are taking the deep convictions that many of us in this community share, and they're doing big things around it, building companies, building firms, building churches, and more. Excited to share Michael Eisenberg, Henry Kasner, and John Manning with you. Share more of their stories here in just a minute. First up, some community news around what's going on across Teneo. It has just been a week, but congratulations are in order for our good friend Glenn Youngkin on his historic victory in the Virginia governor's race. You guys remember Glenn and Susie from their regular participation across Teneo events at the retreat 2 years ago. If you're seeing him on the SitRoom, you're interested, you can check out his episode back from June where he discussed his campaign, raising capital, and why he chose to run. You may have also seen the very scandalous piece in the Washington Post that ran on Glenn's riches, laying out that he had made over $100 million. Interesting subtext was that of the over 140 million, I think, that he made, he gave away 41%. That is a scandal I'd be happy to be a part of. Number two, Governor Greg Abbott appointed epic Tenean Zena Bash to the Texas Judicial Council, which studies the Texas court system and looks for methods to improve while also investigating and reporting on matters referred to the council. Zena is one of many Teneans stepping up along friendship around in Texas and other states around members serving on appointments and in commissions. Teneans continue to be on the march. Many Teneans were on the ballot up for election. There were some difficult losses and some victories on election day last Tuesday. Erin Stewart declared victory in her re-election bid as the mayor of New Britain in Connecticut. This will be her 5th term. Well, there's several upcoming chapter events all around the country. Teneans, as our chapters are coming out of COVID, are getting back together. We are incarnate people. It's one of our design principles, and we're so thankful for all the members that are stepping up to do that. Tomorrow, November 10th, several Teneans will be in Washington, D.C. for a reception before the FedSoc National Lawyers Convention. Several, I think it'll probably be close to 100. We'll be having remarks with board member and good friend, Jonathan Bunch. Thursday, November the 11th through November 14th, members of Teneo Houston are attending the Houston Open at Memorial Park Golf Course to watch new member Tenean Maverick McNeely win, or at least compete very aggressively. Let's say win. Stop by any day to see Marcella Burke at her cabana on the 17th hole. That'll be a pretty epic time to cheer on a fellow member. Thursday, November 11th marks the inauguration of the University of Austin, a new university led by Teneans and friends to Teneo. Among those involved with this new endeavor include Joe Lonsdale, Hillel Ophik, Rob Henderson, Neil Ferguson, Ion Hersea Lee, Arthur Brooks, Barry Weiss, and more. Peter Bogosian texted me a tweet just several hours after the launch of the story yesterday morning, and he said this: since the announcement of University of Austin 5 hours ago, I've received dozens of pleading emails from faculty around the country that boil down to this: the University of Austin looks amazing. Please help me get out of my university. I can't take the madness. I'll work for a fraction of what I'm making now. Amazing and encouraging early news. There'll be lots of opportunities for Teneans to attend the university, teach at it, donate to it, be on the board. Lots of really cool entrepreneurial things this amazing set of leaders are up to. Well, let's turn to today's conversations. We're going to start out with Michael Eisenberg, a new friend to Teneo. Michael Eisenberg, co-founder and partner at Aleph VC, is one of the top venture capitalists in Israel. He joins us to discuss some of the big ideas in his new book, a bit on a book tour. By day, he's a venture capitalist. By night, he's writing super interesting books, many for the first time in Hebrew, later translated into English. He was kind enough to offer to do this interview in English because my Hebrew, well, it's been a long time since seminary. Hey, Michael, let me get into this. I don't know if these show notes are right. Is this true? You have 8 children?
It is. I have 8 children.
Okay, I have 4.
An amazing wife.
I've got to ask, why would you have 8 children? This sounds totally insane to me.
Well, both my wife and I are the oldest of 7 children, and we're big believers both in big family and in children, and the prosperity, innovation, and wonderful family get-togethers that come from children. And I think people who have lots of children have an optimistic view of the future. And I know we certainly do, and love every one of them, and try to make the world a better place for them and the grandchildren. I've got 3 grandkids also. So, it's a wonderful thing. Family is the most important thing in the world.
That's a full house. I love mine. Jim Gaffigan, the comedian, has a great line. He says, "I love my children, especially when they're with someone else." Now, I'm allowed to say that. I have twin 3-year-olds. It's just a season. Well, hey, let's turn to your work and, importantly, this book. It's called The Tree of Life and Prosperity, 21st Century Business Principles from the Book of Genesis. Especially for people that are not part of the Jewish tradition, I'd love if you'd give a little color and context just of your own life and your own experience of reading the Bible, of studying Torah. Before we get into the book, what does that look like for you? How do you study it, and give us a vision of that?
So it really started when I was a kid, obviously in elementary school, where you start to read biblical texts. And when I was in the 3rd grade, my father got me a tutor to teach me Talmudic texts. And that was super important. But a transformational point in my life was I spent 2 years in a yeshiva, which is a Jewish house of study in Israel back in 1989. And I became much more familiar with the kind of full biblical canon, from the 5 books of Moses to the prophets and scripture. And that became an intense period of study where I started to look at the text entirely differently, not just through a Jewish law perspective, but through an actual textual perspective. And I've become dedicated to that. And I do textual study every day since then. And for me, it's the anchor of my day and the anchor of my life and our family life, which is, these are timeless principles. There's something that has spoken to thousands of years and hundreds of generations of people. I often joke that the Bible has more unique users than Google and Facebook combined. We kind of lose track of that. And it's also had more commentaries written on it over thousands of years than anything else. So it means it's relevant in all those generations. And so it manages to maintain a relevance that's stunning. And anything like that, I think, has just, what a friend of mine calls the wisdom of ancients for moderns, that is just absolutely imperative to apply to today. And I think kind of the one thing missing is, how do we apply it to today and to our everyday life? And I think because the Bible's about real people who walk this earth and have real life lessons, and it's about creating a life, there were real people and real families then, and we ought to take those lessons and apply them to today.
I love the story of earlier in your career. I think you were a merchant banker and you had a real heart to create jobs. And that was part of your story of getting into venture capital. So you've got this mission infused reason of why you're in venture capital. You're building companies. Tell us a little bit about the why. Why would you choose? You've written not just this book that we're talking about today, but multiple books. What's the why behind taking the time and slogging through and getting up early and writing the book and distributing and talking about the book? What's the why for this book, The Tree of Life and Prosperity?
So to the point you made earlier, when I was in this yeshiva, this house of Jewish study, I had an interaction with a rabbi where I asked him about commandments and Jewish law. And he said to me, "This is all nonsense. Really, what you need to do is move to Israel and set up a factory that'll employ 10,000 people." And that became a spiritual why, which is you can't just get up and make money. You got to help other people. And this needs to become what I'm calling the empowerment economy, or the responsibility economy. And we all talk about, I should say the politicians talk a lot about redistribution, but not about growing the pie and empowering other people to be successful as well. And so as I started to think about the current bon ton and what the biblical wisdom is on this topic, and I would talk to people about it, I realized that we didn't have a language to talk about this biblical wisdom in modern economic terms and in modern technology terms. And everyone thinks that's kind of old, and what we have now is new and better. And so what I set about doing, really, by the way, around our Sabbath dinner table with our kids, is talking about the biblical portion of the week that we read in synagogues through an economic and technology lens, because that's my day job. I'm a venture capitalist. I invest, I build businesses, I try to create jobs. But the Bible's got what to say about that, like a lot to say about business and what I, again, now call the empowerment or responsibility economy. And we need an interpretive language and an interpretive view of the Bible. And everyone brings their own lens to biblical study, both in the time period they live in, the geography they live in, and what they do. I'm fond of telling people that Rabbi Isaac Dana Barbanel, who was thrown out of Spain in 1492, hated the monarchy, and Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra was a pauper, reads the Bible through a poor man's lens. And I think that's been true of every exegete or commentator over time. And my lens is the economy and technology. And I think that's what's important today, because that's society we're living in.
I think there's a real risk that for many people that their only encounter in the Bible was maybe as a kid in Sunday school or through, popular movies. They just assume that what the Bible has to say about doing business is don't cheat. And certainly the Bible is so old and so outdated that as you would apply stories from the Bible to universal basic income or bioethics or contemporary challenges that certainly were not even on the minds of anyone around a few thousand years ago, what could the Bible have to say? You argue pretty differently. And I'd love if you give us just some color of how you read and interpret some of these amazing biblical stories and they apply to contemporary questions. Maybe you'd kick us off with your story around how you think about the Garden of Eden.
Sure. So the Garden of Eden is a story that, by the way, both in Christian and in Jewish thought has become this utopia on some level. And in Christian thought, it's the place of the original sin, right? And so we try to get away from that. And in Jewish thought, it's utopia, but it's something we don't touch and think about in kind of what I would call real life. But in fact, Adam is placed in the garden and his basic needs are tended to. And if his basic needs are tended to, he's got nothing to do and no work. And, the wheat grows and he can eat the wheat and the fruits grow on the tree and everything kind of works for him. He's so bored because he has nothing to do that he doesn't even talk to Eve. He talks to the serpent. Who ends up tricking him and causing him and his helpmate to sin. And so we have this notion that if we just give people basic sustenance, they'll get out and do creative work. That's the notion of universal basic income proffered by Mark Zuckerberg and sometimes Elon Musk as well, and many kind of social scientists now around who've decided this is a great idea. We actually had a living lab, by the way, during COVID, and that is if you give people basic sustenance, they don't go back to work. So the biblical theory has come true in modern times. And so Adam and Eve have basic sustenance and they don't go to work and they sin. And God throws them out. And I'll also point out there are no children in the Garden of Eden. The children only come after man is expelled from the Garden of Eden. And man has no productivity in the Garden of Eden, only when he goes out of the Garden of Eden and God puts up the sword that is spinning around and preventing us going back to the Garden of Eden. Man creates bread. What is bread? It's the first produced product. Children are the second produced product, by the way, and procreation. And so there is no creativity or creation, which is, I think, what we're in this world to do when man has basic sustenance provided. Only when forced to work does man start doing it. And even though the Bible tells us that man is placed in the Garden of Eden to work it and guard it, he doesn't do it because he has basic sustenance. And I think this is a cautionary tale about UBI, universal basic income. And I think it's what we've seen. I mean, when I wrote the book originally 4 years ago in Hebrew, I didn't intend us to have like a COVID outbreak that would kind of prove the theory, but it's done a hell of a job of showing how timeless the wisdom of the Bible is.
And it's so interesting. I think many of the people that are making the case for UBI are people that in many cases, they actually have all of their needs taken care of and they work their butts off. They're still building. And so there's this thing where I think it's a little bit like, oh, all these poor people that have to work, what if they didn't have to work and they could have this life of leisure? And one of the things it misses, I think, is that what is the purpose of work? What do we get out of work? Yes, it is financial compensation, but there's a lot more. Does the Bible speak to the nature of what is work and why is it valuable separately from earning an income?
I'm glad you raised that, by the way. We lose the notion of human dignity in a lot of these conversations. And human beings achieve dignity not just by getting money to buy food, but by creating and being part of something that is larger than themselves. If you think also what are churches and synagogues about, you become part of a community that's larger than yourself. Well, a work community is like that too. And in fact, the Hebrew Bible's view of charity is not that you give out money. There actually is no giving out money in the Hebrew Bible. Instead, we have what Maimonides calls gifts of the poor, right? Which is not gifts to the poor, but of the poor. And what happens? A man has a field and he leaves over a corner of the field unharvested. And then the poor people or the widows and the orphans come and they harvest the field. They don't get free handouts. They got to go work for it. And the second version of it is when the farm workers are going in the field and they drop sheaves of wheat, the poor people pick it up, but they look like an everyday farm worker. And what we're after is that poor people shouldn't get handouts, but rather should learn a skill, farm working, should have the dignity of being among the workers in the field, and should actually do work on themselves to get that sustenance. That would be akin in modern society. I've got a factory, it's profitable, I got 100 workers. I should take on 2 more workers, give them training, create some slack in the capacity. So if somebody falls off the assembly line, we can replace them, and teach these people a skill at the same time so they achieve human dignity. Giving them money doesn't provide dignity. And I think that's the biblical view of charity, which is not about giving out money, but again, human dignity. And work, therefore, qua work, has value.
It's a great word. Let's move on to the Tower of Babel. Interpret that for us from modern times.
Well, I probably should start with Noah. Can I do that? You want me to start with the Tower of Babel?
Go to Noah. Sure. That's
okay.
That's third. You got so many great things. Start with Noah.
All right. So Noah is important. You ask, someone went to Sunday school, you say, hey, who's Noah? Noah's the guy who built the ark and got us out of the flood. But it turns out that there's 2 kind of stories that surround that story of the ark that are really important. Noah confronts the first Thomas Malthus of the world. Right? Malthus, of course, prophesied, quote unquote, that we wouldn't have enough food to feed people in this world. I'll remind everybody there's 5 times the global population right now, and there's plenty of food. Thank you, Thomas Malthus. And, this guy existed. His name was Jared in the Bible. And he said, stop having kids because there's not going to be enough food. Or, apocalypse now, global warming is going to wipe us all out. Stop having kids, a la Maureen Dowd's recent piece in the New York Times. And it turns out that these guys are wrong all the time. Why? Because innovation comes around. And Noah's first innovation is the plow. The sages suggest this, but it's obvious from the words of the verses as I track in the book. And so Noah invents the plow and uncorks the prosperity of humanity. That's the good news. The bad news, then humanity then destroys itself prior to the flood by becoming immoral, taking advantage of women. And it's the prosperity that kills humanity because it didn't have fundamental principles. Those come about only when Abraham comes post the Tower of Babel, which we'll come back to. Then the flood happens. And Noah has a second innovation, which is chemistry and fermentation. And Noah plants a vineyard. Why does he plant a vineyard? Because wine is the water of the ancients. If you wanted clean water, you needed alcohol. And after a flood, this is true in modern times too, there isn't clean drinking water. So Noah plants a vineyard and develops fermentation and winemaking. But again, it's a dual use technology like the plow. So he uncorks innovation, again, no pun intended in this case. And the wine is created. And Noah, instead of using it for weddings or to gladden the heart or just clean drinking water, gets drunk in his tent and is abused by his son, who ultimately is cursed. So Noah destroys both humanity and his family through an innovation that doesn't have timeless principles attached to it. And that's a cautionary tale of the Bible, of the importance of timeless principles for individual innovators. Same story, by the way, with Alfred Nobel, who, like Noah, dies in melancholy. Noah in his tent, and Alfred Nobel in, I think, San Remo, who invents dynamite, but didn't put principles around it. He only did it posthumously with the Nobel Peace Prize. And so it's a cautionary tale. Then comes the centralization of the same problem, which is the Tower of Babel, which is not an individual inventor who uncorks prosperity, but a guy who decides to harness innovation in city building to gather humanity into one tongue and become the all-powerful leader who could deplatform people, basically, or platform them, as the case may be, to use a modern term. And so the Tower of Babel is basically a story of everybody speaking to some language and one person having the power to kind of convene this. And God's answer, by the way, is not to destroy the tower, but rather to mess up the tongues or the languages of everybody and create 70 disparate societies and 70 disparate languages so that people couldn't be coordinated and deplatformed. And I think this is a modern description of a lot of what's going on the internet right now, which is there's an all-powerful set of platforms where you don't own your own data. There's one kind of proper language to which you need to conform. And if not, you're deplatformed, thrown off the island, so to speak, or thrown off the tower. And that's a pretty risky proposition that I think needs to be scattered, and we need to enable people to be able to own their own data, their own social profiles, and make them portable like the 70 languages. And I think that scattering that God does is a timeless lesson.
Well, as we'll pick up in continued conversations on this show, there is this broader movement, has lots of intersections across Teneo of people of faith thinking deeply about the Bible and theology and bringing that to bear on how they build their companies, how they invest capital, how they run their families, how they're involved in community. And it's really fun to get to stitch you a little bit more into this network. We have Henry Kasner coming up, who's deeply embedded in this world. And it's really fun to share friends with great people. Hey, send us out on this. For someone who's a person of faith, who knows some components of the Bible, but they're a marketplace person, where would people start? They should read your book. That's number one, but that's cheating. Number two, nudge us on in this journey? Is it dive into the scripture? Is it time of prayer with God? How do we get better at this journey ourselves?
I think you need to go out and meet other people, and ask what you can do to empower their success and expand the pie. We don't have enough of a conversation about what is my responsibility to other members of my community who technology may be leaping over, who may not have the skills to compete in this society. And we also haven't done a good enough job of saying, hey, drop this notion of redistribution, number one, but we got responsibility. And I often say that where there's no responsibility, there is regulation. And so it behooves us to get out, meet other people and say, okay, how do I take responsibility for them? I often talk to college kids and I said, if you're in this room, you're one of the lucky 10% or 1% in society. You got to ask how you go out and strap 4 people on your shoulders and bring them into the 21st century and empower them to be successful. And if we work together, one of the core theses of my 3rd book on Leviticus is we believe that if we agree, then we'll work together. It's actually the opposite. If we work together towards a common goal, going back to Adam, etc., then we create an economy of brotherhood and a responsibility economy that grows the pie, and then we have a common language. And so we need to work more broadly with other people to empower them to be successful. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, when people think they're so smart in modern times, we ought to tell them that there were a lot smarter people who came before us. And the further back you go, the better closer you get to kind of timeless wisdom. And we just need more and more people who can interpret those timeless principles into a modern dialogue that we can relate to and implement in our businesses and in our communities. And I'm a big fan of families, obviously. And that's, I think, the second piece.
Well, Michael, the book is The Tree of Life and Prosperity, 21st Century Business Principles from the Book of Genesis. It does have a perfect 5-star rating on Amazon. It's an awesome book, guys. Please buy it and review it. And hey, we look forward to getting to know you better and just so celebrate the work you're doing. You could spend all day just making more money investing in companies, but you take time to teach and to pray and to explore these things that are really important, and we're all better off for it. Thanks for being with us, Michael. Well, guys, joining us